أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Brothers and sisters, as you know, we are here tonight to discuss a menace to humanity in Hindutva. But this is not the only menace that threatens the very existence and the social cohesion of human beings on the earth. Because there's this thing called white supremacy that I just want to talk a little bit about and try to show the relationship between these two evil, wicked, horrible systems of life. You know, growing up in an apartheid state at that particular time in the state of North Carolina, it was very easy for me to understand the caste system in India. When I read books, when we talked about the caste in India, it hit home. Because even though it wasn't called a caste system in the United States, the racial apartheid system that was established from the time of the founding of this country up until 1964, when the racial discrimination laws, where it made it legal to discriminate against people of African descent, where crimes were committed against African American people, and they were done. Very similar to the way we find so many police officers shooting down African American people in the streets like dogs. And almost with no impunity, nothing happens to them except for on occasion. And so what we find when we look at these countries separated by thousands of miles of ocean, when we look at the two systems we have in the United States, we've always said that as a nation, this is the model for democracy of all countries on the earth. And then I learned later that India has always claimed, not always, but in recent times have claimed that India is the largest democracy as related to the people, the largest electoral democracy in the world. So there are similarities with qualities that if they actually applied to these two nations, these nations would genuinely be models for the rest of the world as it relates to social justice. But unfortunately, this is not the case. In about 1959, the recognized leader of the civil rights movement in this country was Dr. Martin Luther King. And in 1959, Dr. King and his wife, Coretta, took a 5-week trip to India because they wanted, first of all, not so much to look at the government and what was going on in that regard. They wanted to go to India to look at the level and degree of poverty that was plaguing so many millions of Indian citizens, hoping that through that experience, it would sensitize their hearts even more to helping the unfortunate. And Dr. King was shocked. He said in his own words, he was almost amazed at what he saw. He knew he wasn't expecting the same level of prosperity relative to the condition of the majority of the people, but he was shocked with what he saw. He was shocked when he saw that there were people he had come from in the United States. He was shocked that there were people called Dalits, that there were people who were locked into the underbelly of the society, that they were cast off so much as worthless human beings, that if their shadow was cast upon someone of a higher caste, then that person may be whipped, he may be killed, he may be punished. And the Brahmin, the one who had this perceived violation would have to cleanse himself. In the United States, and I'm going to kind of jump back and forth till I get to the end of this brief talk. But in the United States, as much as we may be surprised to hear what I'm saying, that at the time of the founding of the United States, there was not a concept of race as it existed, talking about the Europeans who were coming to America. They were coming not because they were identifying as white. They were gaining privileges not because they identified as being white. They were coming to America in these founding days as British. They were coming to America as Irish, as Scottish, as Italians, as French, as Spanish. And out of necessity, because the number of African people who were being brought into the United States and the number of Native American, the indigenous people on the North and South American continent, their numbers were greater than the colonizers who were coming from Europe. And so out of necessity, they recognized that, wait a minute, if we're going to maintain and grab control over this land, we can take it over, but we can't keep fighting each other. We can't carry on with the fights that we had on the European continent. This is a new land, so we have to come up with some new ideas, some new practices. So then a construct called race was created. So now no matter what country they came from, if they were white, they were now part of a group that was forced to unify in order to maintain and to grab and to keep control over these United States. When we look at the history, and you know it much better than I'm almost embarrassed and ashamed to talk about the history of India and the history and the practice of Hindutva, when there's so many. Almost everyone in the audience knows it better than I. But I've never been to India. But I do know that there are some similarities in this hideous practice that goes into play under white supremacy, and the practice that are plaguing this country, even plaguing India. Right now, right here, as we sit, about to have a luxurious dinner, we're talking about because of a prime minister of the Indian government today who oversaw a genocide of Muslims in Gujarat in India. I think it maybe was 2002, somewhere in that time frame. And then at the end of his term as the general of a minister of Gujarat, he was elected the prime minister of the country. It was almost, this is your reward, that the majority of the Indian people said that this is something that we can condone, we can support you. You did a wonderful job with that thing that you were doing against the Muslims. And so we find, as you know better than I, that Modi represents and espouses the philosophy, the ideology of Hindutva, that he espouses, that he was a firm supporter during this massacre, that this BJP party is an offshoot of the fascist group known as RSS. And so the similarities between Hindutva and white supremacy, both in its historical origin, in the practices that our citizens in India are plagued with, is something that you and I have to take notice of. Just a few weeks ago, in Leicester, England, in the UK, not far from London, there were some tremendous problems with many of those who are followers of this BJP party in Lancaster, India, much as we've seen to happen on the Indian subcontinent by these same members of this group and followers of Modi. What we saw recently were just gangs of these BJP followers marching through Muslim communities, not in India, but in the UK, marching in gangs in neighborhoods, beating up Muslim young teenagers, men, women, violating the sanctity of the Muslim sisters that they encountered, not in England, not in India, but in England, in Lancaster, England. And so many similarities in these kinds of abuses of human rights in the United States because of this system of white supremacy. What happened in the United States, that in over 25 different towns and large progressive neighborhoods where African American people were building a life, even under apartheid conditions, that they were building economic security, and they built towns that you are familiar with today, like Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Rosewood in Florida. All around the country, African American people were building infrastructures and businesses that allowed them to be independent of the mercantile trade that was going on that they were excluded from. But what happened to these towns? Many of them were completely relieved that they pushed the citizens out of town because of terrorism. That because of white supremacy, particularly in the year 1919, if you go to check Google and just look at what happened in 1919 in this country, it's like the white Americans had gone mad, they had gone crazy all over the country. There were all kinds of riots. There were all kinds of death squads going through the African American communities. They were destroying homes. In Black Wall Street was considered Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for the first time in the history of this nation, that a neighborhood that on American soil was bombed. And this was a bombed by these crop duster pilots. And what they were doing, they were flying over the African American community and dropping explosives on the African American community, blowing up the houses. And what we find during this particular period from 1919 all the way up until 1970, that the African American community were terrorized not just by individual policemen with a badge shooting down kids like Tamir Rice, 12 years old, sitting in the park playing with a water gun. And 12 seconds after the police arrived, they jumped out of the car and shot this 12-year-old dead. But not just these supposedly law enforcement who have a badge to brutalize in a white supremacist system. What we find is that there are parallels in the actions of destroying homes in India today because of this Hindutva. In India today, houses of the Muslims are being bulldozed. Businesses of the Muslims are being burnt. The merchandise in Muslim businesses are being confiscated and taken. That the Muslim bodies are being violated, men, women, and children, because of an ideology that has its root in a supremacist idea going totally to the contrary of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has identified as the sameness of human beings. And the only thing that makes us better in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our closeness to Allah, not because we are born into a certain caste, not because we are part of a political party, but because we are creatures of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in closing, and before he comes up and cuts off my mic, there are a number of things that you and I have to do. First of all, not be silent witness to a genocide that's unfolding in the country of India at this point, and that it is this Hindutva is creeping primarily, from my vantage point, as a part of interfaith groups living in North Carolina. They are creeping into the interfaith communities. And we can be a part of these communities, and as Muslims, we don't want no trouble. We're not trying to come there to make it hard on any other group of people, but we must be aware that under the cover of interfaith work in this country, under the cover of being a part of campus organizations, that this philosophy is being spread in the United States. And I'm not trying to suggest that what has happened recently in Britain can happen here in the United States. But if you and I are passive observers to something like fascism that came up in Italy and came up in Nazi Germany, if we are passive observers to this, if we don't create alliances and have work with activists in the communities, it's great for us to work in interfaith circles. But this is such a threat to this country, just as white supremacy has been a threat, that we have to find additional partners to take a stand. Get with those, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, get with those people who've spent time fighting against racism in this country, who have a history of fighting against this. Let's see, are there tactics that are halal, that we can learn from those who've had the experience of fighting against racism and bigotry in this country. Assalamu alaikum.